The hum was a living thing, a low, constant thrumming that vibrated through the floor and up my spine. Red light, emergency beacon red, pulsed from unseen sources, bathing the narrow corridor in an oppressive glow. My breath hitched, a thin, rattling sound in the cold, dry air. I wasn't sure how I got here. One moment, I was adrift in the quiet despair of my cramped apartment, staring at the inheritance papers I hadn't yet touched. My head throbbed. This wasn't right. The walls were metallic panels, bolted together with industrial precision, gleaming faintly in the crimson light. Cables, thick as my arm, snaked along the ceiling and floor, disappearing into grates that hummed with unseen machinery. Server racks, I thought, somewhere beyond these walls. This was a server room corridor, a maintenance access way, sterile and functional, but it was also endless. I turned, a slow pivot, my worn sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. Corridor stretched behind me, identical to the stretch in front. No doors, no emergency exits, just the relentless mechanical hum and the pulsing red. Where was the way out? A sudden sharp crack echoed from the gravel crunched under the tires, a sound that felt impossibly loud in the overwhelming silence. The drive was a narrow, overgrown path, flanked by skeletal trees that clawed at the gray sky. For the last hour, the world outside my windshield had been nothing but dense. Suffocating woods, broken only by the occasional sun-bleached signpost pointing to towns I'd never heard of, towns I suspected no longer existed. Now finally, the trees receded, revealing it. The house. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a hulking monument to forgotten grandeur. 3 stories of dark stone and peeling paint, crowned with a roof of jagged slate tiles. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from behind a tangled curtain of ivy. A stone wall, crumbled in places, tried to hold back the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. I cut the engine. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. Just the wind and something else, a subtle groan deep within the house that might have been the timbers settling or might have been something else entirely. I clutched the steering wheel, my grip tight. This was it, my fresh start. Why did it feel so much like an end? Getting out of the car, the air tasted metallic, like old pennies. The front door, a heavy oak slab adorned with tarnished ironwork, was swollen in its frame. My breath hitched. It slid into the lock with an unexpected ease, turning with a grinding protest that reverberated through the silent landscape. The interior was a tomb. A thick blanket of dust covered every surface, disturbed only by the narrow shafts of light that pierced through the grimy windows, dancing with motes of suspended particles. The air was frigid, despite the lingering warmth outside, carrying the potent aroma of mildewed fabric, stale wood, and something indefinable, something acrid and old. The main hall, with its towering ceiling and faded wallpaper, felt like a distorted memory. It was my childhood home, but proportions are wrong, an unsettling echo of familiar spaces stretched and warped. The grand staircase, instead of feeling welcoming, rose into the gloom like a skeletal spine, its banister slick with dust. A shiver traced its way down my spine, but I ignored it. I needed to see everything. I pushed further, each step sending a puff of dust into the still air. To my right, a dining room, equally enormous, where a crystal chandelier hung precariously, reflecting the dim light in 1,000 fractured points. It was too big, all of it, too empty. I ran my hand over a dust-laden table, the fine grit clinging to my skin. As my fingers brushed against the polished wood, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible thump from somewhere above, like something heavy being gently set down. I froze, head cocked. Just the wind, I told myself, or the house settling. Old houses made noises, didn't they? Up the skeletal staircase I went, each creak of the ancient wood a jolt to my nerves. I chose one at random, pushing open a door that groaned like a dying beast. This must have been a bedroom. A 4-poster bed, draped in a heavy, moth-eaten canopy, stood in the center, a spectral sentinel. The wallpaper, a floral pattern faded beyond recognition, peeled in long, curling strips. As I crossed the threshold, the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees, raising goosebumps on my arms. I saw my breath, a faint cloud in the frigid air. My jaw tightened. My hand, trembling slightly, reached for the brass handle. It was frozen to the touch. I pulled, and the heavy door swung open, revealing not clothes, but empty shelves lined with more dust. It was a small wooden box, ornate and intricately carved, almost identical in design to the armoire itself. A low, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from it, a vibration I felt more in my teeth than heard. It was locked, but a small, delicate key lay beside it, almost swallowed by the dust. The key was warm, unnaturally so, as if it had just been held. I fumbled it into the tiny keyhole, the tumblers clicking with a faint, sharp sound. The lid opened. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single tarnished silver locket. As I lifted the locket, a faint tremor ran through the floorboards beneath my feet. Not a creak, but a deliberate shudder, as if the house itself had just exhaled. The armoire door, which I had left ajar, slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the very bones of the house. I jumped back, dropping the locket, my heart racing. Was I truly alone in this house, broken only by the occasional skeletal branch scraping against the car's roof? The air grew heavier with each turn, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and ancient, like forgotten things unearthed. Then, through a final, arching tunnel of cypress and gnarled oak, the house appeared. It wasn't what I'd expected, not exactly. My mind had conjured images from old movies, sprawling Victorian mansions or crumbling Gothic estates. This house was none of those. It was a two-story structure of weathered gray stone and dark timber, severe and unadorned. Yet despite its unfamiliarity, a strange sense of recognition pricked at me. It felt like my childhood home, but proportions are wrong. The windows, narrow and tall, seemed to stretch too far, like eyes perpetually wide with surprise. The front door, a heavy slab of dark wood, sat off-center, lending the whole facade a lopsided, almost mocking grin. It wasn't grand, it was simply off, unsettling. I killed the engine. Dust motes danced in the last rays of the dying sun, slanting through the gaps in the trees, painting the air a hazy gold. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, my breath shallow. This was it, my new beginning or something. Stepping out, the gravel crunched again under my boots, a sound that felt like a betrayal of the stillness. I walked towards the front door, the heavy iron knocker already corroded green. As my fingers brushed against the cold metal, a whisper seemed to sigh past my ear, like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten floor. I spun around, my heart giving a sudden violent lurch against my ribs. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself, a gust playing through the dying foliage. The house was old. Of course, it made noises. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite place, a faint sweetness, like dried flowers, underlaid by a deeper mineral earthiness. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the bare floorboards as I ventured into what must have been the living room. Every creak of the old house settling, every rustle of wind outside, snagged at my nerves. I spent the next few days in a haze of unpacking and discovery. The house was larger than it appeared from the outside, a labyrinth of rooms, many of them locked or boarded up. I found myself drawn to the library, a vast room with towering shelves of decaying books, their pages brittle and yellowed. It was here, on the second evening, that the first undeniable oddity occurred. I was organizing a small stack of books I'd brought, trying to carve out a corner of normalcy in the sprawling strangeness. I placed a worn copy of a classic novel, its spine cracked, on a low table beside an armchair. I remembered the exact spot, the slight tilt of the table leg. Later that night, returning to the library for a glass of water I'd forgotten, I saw it. The book was no longer on the table. It lay on the floor, open, face down, several feet away, almost as if it had been tossed. My breath hitched. Just, the house settling, I murmured, my voice sounding thin and weak in the cavernous space. Old houses do that, things fall. I picked up the book, closed it, and placed it back on the table carefully. I even pushed the table against the wall just to be sure. My hands trembled slightly, a tremor I attributed to exhaustion. The next morning, the book was back on the floor, in the exact same spot. Open, face down. My initial rationalization faltered. A book doesn't just jump. But what else could it be? I was alone. There was no one else in this isolated place. It had to be me. Sleep deprivation, grief playing tricks. I was still reeling from everything. This time, I put it on a different shelf, high up, wedged between two larger volumes. My heart hammered. I stood still, listening, straining my ears. The house was utterly silent, save for the distant, mournful sigh of the wind. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, the dust, the dim light filtering through grimy windows. My mind, still raw, was simply manufacturing things. Not actual words, not distinct sentences, but a low, sibilant murmur, like many voices speaking at once, just beyond the edge of comprehension. I tried to ignore them, to hum over them, to blast music from my phone, but they persisted, a subtle pressure on my eardrums. I started talking to myself, explaining away each incident aloud, as if convincing myself would somehow banish the phenomena. Just the pipes, I'd say, after a metallic groan echoed from the floorboards below me. The wind caught it. When a door I was sure I'd closed stood ajar. One evening I was in the kitchen making a simple meal. The old stove sputtered, its pilot light a faint blue flicker. Then from the corner of the room near the pantry door I felt it. A sudden, intense drop in temperature, like walking into a freezer. My breath plumed, my skin prickled with goosebumps. I spun around, clutching the spatula like a weapon. There was nothing. I forced myself to finish cooking, my hands shaking. I ate quickly, eyes darting around the room, convinced something was watching me. There was the top of the stairs, a corner of the library, and now the kitchen. Was it just the old house settling into its decay, or was something else settling in with me? The car finally pushed through, spitting gravel onto the overgrown drive. Before me stood the house. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a monolith of weathered stone and peeling paint, shrouded in vines that clawed at its eaves like skeletal fingers. The windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare not at me but through me into some distant, forgotten past. And yet a flicker of recognition, a phantom echo of memory caught in my chest. It felt like a memory, warped, stretched, a childhood home, but proportions are wrong. The angles were too sharp, the roofline too severe, the porch too deep and shadowed. My breath hitched. I had never seen this place before, not truly, yet it tugged at something deep, a sense of belonging that was unsettlingly alien. I cut the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the persistent whisper of the wind through the cypress. I sat there for a long moment, the scent of damp earth and that cloying, ancient sweetness now thick in the air inside the car, pressing against the windows. This was it, my fresh start, my inheritance, my new beginning. Unloading the car was a blur. Each box I carried across the threshold felt heavier than the last, as if the very air inside resisted my intrusion. My footsteps echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the downstairs. I chose a room on the second floor, one with a fireplace and a slightly less broken window, and began to unpack. The act was mundane, a deliberate anchor against the growing unease. I set up my laptop on a rickety bedside table, hoping the weak signal would hold. As dusk bled into night, the house truly awoke. It wasn't just the settling creaks of old timber. There were distinct sounds. A soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump from the floor above me, like something heavy being dragged, then stopping, then starting again. I froze, my hand midair, holding a framed photograph of my mother. "Hello," I called out, my voice thin and reedy in the sudden quiet. The thumping stopped. Absolute stillness. I told myself it was just the house, old pipes, branches scraping the roof. But the branches weren't that heavy. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my laptop. I pulled up a search engine, my fingers hesitant over the keys. Ancestral home, I typed, then the town's name, then the house's rough address. The internet was a fickle beast out here, but after several frustrating attempts, a few local history forums blinked onto the screen. Most posts were about the town's founding, old families, nothing specific to this house. Then I found a thread buried deep from years ago. A user had asked about the old Blackwood place, mentioning rumors of strange occurrences, disappearances. The thread quickly devolved into skepticism and local jokes, but one response caught my eye. My great-grandmother always said that house had a hunger, said it fed on sadness. I dismissed it as old wives' tales, but a knot tightened in my stomach. It felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down. I pulled my sweater tighter. I could feel it now, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a presence that wasn't just cold air. It was a stillness that absorbed sound, a pressure that made my ears ache. My skin prickled. I wasn't alone. Determined to find something concrete, something to ground me, I left the relative warmth of my room. I found an old study downstairs, filled with forgotten furniture shrouded in yellowed sheets. A massive oak desk dominated the room, its surface thick with dust. I pulled open a drawer. Inside, beneath a layer of dried inkwells and rusty nibs, I found a stack of brittle, leather-bound journals. The first few pages were water-stained, the script faded, but I could make out dates from the late 1800. I carefully turned a page, my fingers tracing the elegant loops of an unknown hand. The journal spoke of mundane daily life, the weather, crops. It drains the very light from the room. A shiver ran through me. I continued to read, moving past entries about garden yields and social visits. The writing grew more erratic, the sentences shorter, punctuated by hurried dashes. He hears them now. They promise release. I tell him it is the fever, but his eyes, they are not his own. The handwriting became almost illegible, a frantic scrawl. The house hungers, it calls to him, I cannot stop it. The last entry was brief, stark, gone, my skin crawled. I wasn't reading about some abstract historical event. I was reading about this house, and I felt something else too, a new, unsettling sensation, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure against the back of my neck, like an unseen breath. What had taken him, and what did it want with me? My skin crawled. 1,000 invisible spiders skittering across my forearms, up my neck. I snatched my hand back from the journal, the ancient leather cool and dry against my palm. The frigid air, which had been confined to the upstairs corridor, now permeated the entire library, a palpable presence that sank into the marrow of my bones. It wasn't just cold. It was a knowing cold, an intelligent chill that seemed to probe and test the warmth within me. The silence of the house had deepened. No longer a mere absence of sound, but a profound, expectant hush, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for my next move. I forced myself to breathe, to push past the sudden, sharp spike of unease. This was what I'd come here for, wasn't it? To understand, to find answers. My fingers, still tingling, found the spine of the journal again. I wouldn't slam it shut this time. The previous entry had been truncated, a desperate scrawl about the changing rooms. I needed more context. The library, despite its disarray, felt like the heart of the house's secrets. I began to methodically search, not just for books, but for anything that looked out of place: loose floorboards, hidden compartments, forgotten drawers. The shelves were crammed with dusty tomes on forgotten histories, obscure sciences, and even some archaic texts on architecture. My fingers traced the spines, the dry paper rasping under my touch, leaving a fine film of grit on my skin. Behind a particularly dense collection of leather-bound volumes on 18th-century agricultural practices, my hand brushed against something yielding. Not wood, not paper, fabric. I pulled out a stack of books, revealing a narrow, almost imperceptible gap in the shelving. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and more dust, was a small, ornate wooden box. It wasn't locked. The lid lifted with a faint creak, revealing a chaotic jumble of yellowed letters, brittle photographs, and a slim, leather-bound diary, much smaller than the journal I'd just read. The scent that wafted from the box was distinct: old paper, dried flowers, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old pennies left in the rain. I picked up a photograph. It showed a family group, stiff and unsmiling, standing before a house that was undeniably this house, yet subtly wrong. The porch seemed too wide, the windows on the second floor disproportionately tall, and a strange, squat tower I'd never noticed before jutted awkwardly from one side. It was like looking at a reflection in warped glass, familiar yet utterly alien. It was my childhood home, but the proportions were wrong. I put the photo aside, a knot tightening in my stomach. The diary beckoned. Its cover was smooth, almost unblemished, despite its age. The handwriting inside was elegant, flowing, utterly unlike the frantic scrawl of the earlier journal. The first entry was dated 1887. It belonged to a woman, a new bride, writing of her excitement for her new life within these walls. "The house breathes," she wrote, "a comforting sigh in the quiet hours. My husband assures me it is merely the old timbers settling, but I confess, I sometimes feel a presence, a watchful eye upon me." Her initial delight gave way to unease. She described peculiar drafts that no amount of sealing could prevent, the scent of mildew and damp earth rising from the floorboards, even in the driest weather. Then came the true horror. "My husband's temperament has soured." An entry from 1890 read, "He stares at the walls, at nothing. He says the house is alive and it wants him. I fear for his sanity, I fear for my own." A later entry, barely legible, spoke of him trying to brick up a doorway in the cellar, convinced it was coming through. It ended abruptly with a smeared, frantic line: "He is gone, vanished. The door is open, the house, it smiles." My breath hitched. just like the previous journal hinted. I thumbed through more pages. She speaks of a childhood home, but the proportions are wrong, the windows too high, the door too wide. She says it's pulling her back. I fear he is lost to me. My eyes darted to the photograph I'd found earlier. The subtle distortions. The childhood home, but the proportions were wrong. It wasn't just a random oddity, it was a symptom, a pattern. It was all here laid out in brittle ink. This wasn't just an old house, it was a predator, and I was its newest occupant. The words blurred, the stories of despair and dissolution swirling in my mind like a noxious fog. When I finally closed the diary, my hands were trembling. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind against the windows, sounded like a deliberate motion, a watchful breath. I couldn't stay there any longer. The stories had seeped into the air, into my very skin. I needed to escape the suffocating weight of history, if only for a few hours. Sleep offered no respite. The moment my eyes closed, the house seeped into my consciousness. I was standing in a familiar hallway. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern I remembered from my earliest years. It was my childhood home. I tried to walk, but my feet were heavy, as if I were wading through thick mud. It spoke my name, Seth, but stretched it, elongated it into something alien and wrong. Then it began to list the names from the diaries, the husband who vanished, the wife who lost her memories, the others, the nameless ones. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a frantic urge to escape, to run from the suffocating familiarity of the place, made monstrous by its altered dimensions. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Had it been a dream, or had the house merely shown me a glimpse of what it had done to others and what it now intended for me? I woke with a gasp, my body rigid, sheets tangled around my legs. The room was dark, but the dream clung to me like a shroud. My skin was slick with cold sweat, and my throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming. I pushed myself upright, breath catching. The dream had been a jumble of familiar faces, distorted, screaming my name from impossible distances. My vision felt blurry, as if the edges of the room were dissolving. Was it just a dream? The question felt weak, a fragile shield against the certainty that something had truly touched me, reached into the deepest, most vulnerable parts of my mind. I stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, the sting a welcome jolt of reality. The reflection staring back was pale, eyes wide and bloodshot. I barely recognized myself. This place, this ancestral home I'd never known, was stripping me down day by day, leaving only a raw, exposed nerve. I needed coffee. I needed light. As I moved through the hallway, I noticed at first a subtle shift. The ceiling felt lower, pressing down on me, even though I knew the dimensions of this house. The hallway seemed to stretch, longer than it had been yesterday, the old wallpaper patterns receding into a dizzying perspective. I paused, my hand on the cool, rough plaster. Was I still half asleep? My mind, I reminded myself, was playing tricks. It had to be. I reached the kitchen, the familiar layout a comfort, but even here things felt off. The window above the sink, which usually offered a view of the overgrown garden, now showed only a dense, impenetrable wall of fog. Even though I remembered the morning being clear, I peered closer, pressing my face to the glass. It wasn't fog. It was as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gray, featureless expanse. I pulled back sharply, my breath fogging the pain. Then I saw it. On the counter, nestled between the kettle and the toaster, was a small, tarnished silver locket. My stomach lurched. It was my grandmother's. The one she'd worn every day. The one I'd last seen in a box of her things, packed away after her passing. How could it be here? I hadn't brought it. I knew I hadn't. My hands trembled as I picked it up. My grandmother had loved me fiercely, but her death had been one of the losses that had driven me here, seeking escape. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over me, mixing with the growing unease. I clutched the locket, my grip tight. This wasn't right. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks. This was deliberate. Someone or something was putting it here, knowing its significance, but who and how? I forced myself to brew coffee, the mundane task a desperate anchor. I sat at the small, chipped table, the locket still in my palm. My gaze drifted to the pantry door, usually a plain, unadorned rectangle. Now carved into the soft wood were faint, swirling patterns. They looked like ancient runes, or perhaps just crude, meaningless scratches. I hadn't seen them yesterday. I was sure. I walked over, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My fingers traced the grooves. They were shallow, old, as if weathered by time, yet I knew they hadn't been there. My memory insisted they were new. The kitchen was empty. The sound had been so clear, so close, yet it felt as if it had come from inside my own head. My breath hitched. Was I truly hearing things now? I retreated, backing away from the pantry door, from the locket, from the impassable fog outside the window. My childhood home, but proportions were wrong. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, its walls shifting, expanding, contracting. The floorboards creaked underfoot, not with the familiar settling of an old house, but with a deliberate, almost mocking cadence. I needed proof. I needed to document this. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I took a picture of the locket on the counter, then another of the pantry door's carvings. I zoomed in, trying to capture the impossible detail. When I looked back at the screen, the locket was gone from the counter. The pantry door was smooth, unblemished, as it always had been. My hands began to shake violently. I stared at the phone, then at the counter, then at the pantry. The locket was truly gone. The carvings were truly gone. But the pictures remained on my phone, undeniable evidence of what I had seen, what I had known to be real just moments before. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the two realities. Was I going insane? There was this house, this malevolent presence, finally succeeding in unraveling my sanity. My eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for any other anomaly, any other sign that I wasn't losing my grip. What was real and what was merely a cruel illusion? My breath hitched, ragged and thin in the empty kitchen. The word alone still vibrated in the hollow space behind my eyes, a venomous whisper that felt like it had been carved directly into my skull. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the scent of damp wood and something vaguely metallic clinging to the air. My own shadow stretched long and distorted across the checkered linoleum, a silent, mocking companion. Was I losing it? Was this the final unraveling? I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against them, trying to push the sound back to erase its insidious imprint. When I opened them again, the kitchen still stretched before me, too wide, too tall, like a stage set built for giants. I needed to clear my head. My phone, I would call someone, anyone, a colleague from my old job, an acquaintance, someone who could offer a real voice, a connection to the world outside this decaying shell. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and damp with sweat. It was in my pocket, solid and reassuring. I walked, or rather drifted, through the house, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight as if in protest. The air grew heavier with each step, thick and cloying like unstirred treacle. I found myself in a room I hadn't truly explored, a vast echoing space that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at it. It was impossibly my childhood home, but the proportions were wrong. The ceiling soared too high, the walls bowed inwards, and the windows, instead of looking out onto the familiar street, stared blankly at a dense, unmoving fog. A single dusty rocking horse stood in the center, its painted eyes fixed on some unseen point, its mane tangled and matted. A strange warmth began to emanate from the rocking horse. Not a physical heat, but a comforting glow that spread through the room, softening the harsh angles, making the dust motes dance in the air like tiny, benevolent sprites. My muscles, coiled tight with tension, began to relax. A profound sense of peace, alien and intoxicating, washed over me. "You don't have to be alone," a soft, melodic voice echoed, not in my head this time, but seemingly from the very air around me. It was gentle, inviting, utterly devoid of the malice I had come to associate with this place. "You don't have to be alone, Seth, never again." The words wrapped around me like a warm embrace, a promise. My hand, still clutching the phone, slowly lowered. The rocking horse seemed to sway imperceptibly, its wooden runners squeaking a soft rhythm. I felt a yearning, deep and primal, to sink into that comfort, to let it consume me, to finally, truly, not be alone. It was a temptation so potent it made my knees weak. The rocking horse's painted eyes, though still fixed, seemed to glint with an unnerving intelligence. The hum, while still soothing, now held a subtle, persistent undertone, like a drone that never quite resolved. And the scent, beneath the damp wood and metallic tang, I now detected something else, something cloying and sweet, like wilting flowers left too long in stagnant water. It was too perfect, too easy. My grip tightened on the phone again. No, this wasn't comfort. This was a lure. I forced my thumb to unlock the screen, my fingers fumbling through my contacts. I found the name of an old college friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but whose voice I remembered as steady and kind. I pressed call, The phone rang, once, twice. Each ring vibrated through my hand, a lifeline to reality. I held my breath, waiting. On the third ring, a sharp, metallic screech erupted from the earpiece, piercing and violent, like nails dragged across a chalkboard. It wasn't the sound of a bad connection. It was a deliberate assault. I pulled the phone away, wincing, my ear ringing. The rocking horse continued its gentle sway, the hum growing a fraction louder, a fraction more insistent. I tried again. This time, as soon as my finger hit call, the screen went black, utterly, completely dead. The battery indicator had been full just moments before. I pressed the power button, jabbed at it. Nothing, useless. The hum in the room intensified, no longer a lullaby, but a throbbing vibration that resonated in my chest. The comforting warmth now felt like a suffocating blanket, pressing in on me. The air grew thick, making it hard to draw a full breath. The walls of the childhood home, but proportions are wrong, seemed to press inward, the ceiling dipping, the floorboards groaning under an invisible weight. Panic clawed its way up my throat. It wasn't just my phone. It was everything. This house, this presence, it wasn't offering comfort. It was offering itself, and it wanted me entirely. It wanted me isolated, broken, and ready to accept its twisted companionship. My eyes darted around the shrinking room. That rocking horse, still swaying, its painted eyes somehow wider now, more expectant. I looked away from it, towards the nearest wall, desperate for a different focal point. It looked old, almost black, and strangely uniform. My fingers scraped at the brittle paper. It gave way easily, flaking into dust. Beneath it, carved into the ancient wood, was a single, crudely etched word. No, it wasn't just a word. It was a desperate, jagged declaration. And next to it, scratched even deeper, almost tearing the grain of the wood, was a crudely drawn symbol. A circle. And within that circle, a single, wide-open eye staring out from the wall. Not an eye like a human eye, an eye that seemed to hold a vast, unblinking emptiness. Someone else had been here. Someone else had seen it, understood it, and tried to fight it, but who? And what did they see that made them scratch that warning into the very bones of the house? The hum throbbed around me, a silent question that seemed to mock my every fear. An eye that seemed to swim in the grain, not carved, but somehow there. It was too large, too perfectly round for a human likeness, with an iris that swirled with dark, milky colors I couldn't quite define, like oil on stagnant water. And the pupil, a vast, hungry blackness, felt like it wasn't just looking at the wall, but through it, through the house, through me. My breath hitched. The air in the room, already heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten dust, seemed to thicken, pressing against my lungs. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that whispers of unseen observation. I tried to rationalize it, a trick of the light, a knot in the wood, perhaps, exaggerated by my own tired mind. But the jagged letters, the desperate plea of watchers, anchored it to something undeniably deliberate. Someone had etched their fear here, and that fear had drawn a symbol to represent its source. My hand, still holding the scraper, trembled. I wanted to destroy it, to gouge out that watching eye, but a strange paralysis held me. I backed away slowly, my gaze snagged on the symbol, feeling its imagined weight against my skin. I retreated from the study, needing space, needing to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through that silent, staring gaze. My steps were heavy, deliberate, each one an act of defiance against the growing unease. I found myself drawn towards the back of the house, towards a room I rarely used, a smaller sitting area that always felt a little off-kilter. As I stepped across the threshold, a wave of disorienting familiarity washed over me. It was like walking into my own childhood home, but proportions are wrong. The fireplace was too wide, the mantelpiece too low. The windows, usually framing the overgrown garden, now seemed to stretch upwards, narrower than I remembered, distorting the light that filtered through them. The walls leaned inwards, imperceptibly at first, then with a sickening certainty, creating an acute angle at the far corner that defied architectural logic. I stopped dead, my eyes tracing the impassable lines. This wasn't just old. It was fundamentally wrong. A low groan rumbled through the floorboards beneath my feet, not the settling of an old house, but a deep, resonant sound, like a living thing shifting its weight. I turned, intending to leave to find a normal room, a sane space, but the doorway I had just entered was gone. In its place was a solid expanse of wall, rough plaster, and peeling wallpaper. No frame, no handle, no indication of an opening. It was just closed, sealed. My mouth went dry. There was no seam, no give. It was as if it had never existed. Panic, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. I spun around, scanning the room frantically. The impossibly tall windows, the leaning walls, they seemed to press in closer now, their distorted angles more pronounced, more menacing. The air grew thick with a smell I couldn't place, damp earth and something acrid, like old iron mixed with a hint of decay. I looked up, and that's when I saw it. On the wall directly opposite me, where a faded landscape painting usually hung, was another carving. Fresh, raw, the same crude symbol, the circle, the wide, staring eye, and beneath it, etched with undeniable clarity, was a single stark word. Mine. It wasn't scratched into the plaster like the one in the study. This was gouged, deep. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the entire room, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth. The walls, those leaning, distorted walls, seemed to pulse, to breathe. Then slowly, deliberately, the door to the room, a door that hadn't been there moments ago, materialized on the adjacent wall. It wasn't just a door, it felt like a barrier. And from behind it, from the unseen space beyond, came a sound. A guttural, dragging rasp. Like something enormous, something with immense weight and rough hide, being pulled across a stone floor. It was slow, relentless. Each scrape echoed through the impossibly proportioned room, vibrating in my bones, making my teeth ache. It was coming closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. The house was alive, and it was trying to get to me, or worse, it already had me. I pressed myself against the armchair, my muscles rigid, every nerve screaming. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, right up against the heavy oak door. And then, a single, deliberate knock. Not a human knock. A dull, heavy thud that made the entire door shudder in its frame. What was on the other side? And how could I possibly escape? The wall, it seemed to breathe. A slow, deep exhalation that stirred the dust motes in the air around me. That low thrum vibrated in my teeth, a bone-deep resonance that promised something terrible was about to give way. I stared at the gouge, a jagged wound in the plaster, raw lath exposed like splintered bone. It wasn't just a mark. It was a tearing, a frantic, desperate act. My fingers, numb with a cold I hadn't felt since the funeral, traced the edges of the wound. The plaster crumbled under my touch, fine white dust clinging to my skin. The thrum intensified, a low growl now emanating from the wall itself. I pressed harder, searching for a reason, a clue, anything beyond the sheer violence of the mark. My thumb caught on something, a seam, not part of the original plasterwork, but a cleverly disguised panel, barely visible beneath the layers of paint and grime. It was roughly the size of a brick, set just above the gouge. I pushed, nothing. I tried again, digging my fingernails into the faint crack, and this time, with a groan that echoed the house's own, the panel gave. It didn't swing open. It slid inward, receding into the wall with a soft sigh of displaced air. Behind it, a cavity, not deep, but just large enough to hold something. My hand trembled as I reached into the cool, dry darkness. I pulled it out. It was a journal, thick, heavy, its leather cover cracked and flaking, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. The pages, yellowed and fragile, seemed to hum with a silent energy. My eyes scanned the cover, searching for a name, a date. Just the faint imprint of what might once have been a symbol, now worn smooth by time and handling. I flipped open the clasp. The first page was blank, save for a single spidery inscription at the top. The keeper's ledger. My breath hitched. The keeper. The phrase from the study, the one scratched into the plaster. It wasn't a warning to me, it was a title, a role. I started to read, my eyes devouring the cramped, faded script. The entries weren't dated, but they formed a chronological descent into madness. The air grows thick. One entry read, like breathing dust and sorrow, I feel smaller. The house around me began to respond. The thrumming in the wall deepened, vibrating through the floorboards, up into my very bones. It was as if the house itself was listening, its ancient timbers groaning in protest or perhaps in anticipation. I turned a page. The writing became more frantic, the lines slanting wildly across the page. The keeper described a presence, formless but constant, that whispered at the edges of hearing. Not words, but concepts. Ideas of loss, of isolation, of the futility of resistance. It feeds on the quiet places within me, the entry confessed, the cracks left by the departed. The house, this place I had thought was just a decaying structure, was more than that. It was a crucible, a trap. The entries detailed how the entity didn't just haunt, it consumed. It didn't just scare, it reshaped. It blurred the edges of reality, twisting perceptions until the victim could no longer trust their own mind. I remembered the feeling sometimes that I was in my childhood home, but the proportions were wrong. The ceilings too high, the hallways too long. A trick of the light, I'd told myself, a trick of memory, but the journal described it precisely. It shows me what I yearn for, then warps it, the keeper wrote. My father's voice, but it speaks only despair. It makes the familiar monstrous until nothing is safe. This was its nature, not a ghost, but a predator of the mind. It didn't seek to scare its victims to death. It sought to harvest their despair, to cultivate their grief until it was ripe for consumption. It didn't want to kill, it wanted to feed. The journal's author, I gathered, was the last true keeper, a distant relative who had understood the horror. He had tried to fight it, to starve it. He had tried to leave, but the entity had woven itself into his very being, making the outside world seem alien, hostile, unreal. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in a hand that was almost certainly dying. It is ancient, older than this house, older than my line. It attaches itself to the lonely places, the forgotten corners of the world, and waits. It does not die. It merely slumbers until a new heart, broken and adrift, comes to wake it. I am its food now, my loneliness, my grief. It is a feast. It will take my body next, and then it will wear my skin. My breath caught in my throat. Wear his skin, not just consume his mind, but inhabit his physical form. It explained the feeling I sometimes had, that I wasn't alone in my own skin, that another presence was just beneath the surface. It explained the strange reflections, the moments when my own face seemed alien in the glass. The journal slipped from my trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards. The thrumming from the wall was a roar now, vibrating through the entire house, shaking the very foundations. I could feel it pressing in, a suffocating weight. This wasn't just a house, it was a prison, and I wasn't just its inheritor. I was its next meal. But how do I fight something that feeds on my very essence, something that wears the mask of my deepest desires and twists them into nightmares? How do I fight something that has already begun to wear my skin? My breath still hitched, a raw, ragged sound in the cavernous silence. Wear his skin. The words echoed, not just in my mind, but in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't enough to simply consume my mind, to feed on my despair until I was a hollowed-out shell. No, it wanted more. It wanted my physical form. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a hostile takeover, a parasitic invasion. I wouldn't let it. I would not become another skin for it to wear, another puppet in its grim charade. My losses, my grief, my aimlessness, these were the bait, the fuel, but I was still me, and I was still here. My gaze swept the cluttered study, the dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the grimy panes. Escape. That was the only option left. Not just a temporary retreat into another room, not a desperate plea to an unseen presence, but a full, permanent severing. I needed to leave this house, leave this land, and never look back. I needed to starve it, deny it the very air it breathed. The plan formed, swift and desperate. I would pack only essentials. No mementos, no photographs, nothing that tied me to the past, nothing that could be twisted into fresh despair. I would walk out the front door, get into the old truck, and drive until the house was nothing but a speck in the rearview mirror, then drive some more until it was a forgotten nightmare. It was simple. It was logical. It was my only chance. A new resolve stiffened my spine. My hands, though still trembling, found purpose. I moved through the house with a frantic energy, pulling a duffel bag from the back of the closet, tossing in a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush. I heard a faint creak from the floorboards above, then a soft scraping sound from behind a closed door. My breath hitched, but I didn't stop. I wouldn't. This was it. My heart hammered against my ribs, not in fear, but in a strange, desperate hope. I was fighting back. I was making a choice. The front door. It was only a few rooms away. I could feel the house watching, its unseen eyes burning into my back. A low moan, like wind through a broken pipe, seemed to rise from the floorboards beneath my feet. I pushed through the parlor, the heavy velvet drapes seeming to cling to the air, suffocating. The grand hall stretched before me, longer than I remembered, the distance to the front door suddenly immense. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood and decaying flowers. As I neared the massive oak door, a flicker in my peripheral vision caught my attention. The wall to my right, where a large, ornate mirror usually hung, was empty. No, not empty, it was different. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, was peeling in precisely the wrong places, revealing patches of rough, unpainted plaster underneath. It wasn't the wallpaper I remembered. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I stopped, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The door itself felt wrong. I swallowed, a dry, rasping sound. I tried the knob. It turned easily, silently. I pulled it open, a sliver of the outside world, or what I hoped was the outside world, beckoning. But the light wasn't the pale afternoon glow I expected. It was dim, yellowish, emanating from a single, bare bulb hanging precariously from a high ceiling. My eyes struggled to adjust. The doorway didn't lead to the familiar porch and overgrown drive. It led into a long, narrow hallway, lined with doors on either side. The wallpaper here was different again, a saccharine pattern of bluebirds and tiny roses, peeling in strips. The carpet underfoot was a threadbare floral monstrosity, smelling faintly of mildew and old dust. It was a hallway I knew intimately from a time long past. This was my childhood home. But the proportions were wrong. The ceiling was too high, the doors too narrow, stretching unnaturally. The hallway seemed to go on forever, receding into the gloom. The air was heavy, stagnant, imbued with a familiar, suffocating stillness. My heart began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs, no longer a beat of defiance, but of pure, unadulterated fear. I had tried to escape. I had planned, I had acted, but the house hadn't just watched. It had waited. It had anticipated my move and twisted itself into a more potent snare. The front door, my exit, had become a portal, leading me not to freedom but deeper into its labyrinthine deception. I wasn't outside. I was inside still, but where? What had I walked into? My physical self. That's what it craved now, a husk to wear, a skin to inhabit and mimic. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, sharper than any grief, colder than any despair. Blood, which had felt like sludge for months, now pulsed with a frantic, desperate rhythm, a last-gasp protest against the inevitable. The air in the room thickened, not with smoke or dust, but with a palpable pressure like descending into deep water. My vision blurred at the edges, the familiar walls of the house rippling and distending. I stared at my hands, splayed on the scarred wooden table. They looked alien, the skin too pale, the veins too prominent, the fingers elongated, twitching with a life that wasn't quite my own. A coldness seeped into my bones, a deep-seated chill that radiated from within, pushing outwards, trying to supplant the warmth of my own existence. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like columns of lead, rooted to the floor. A low hum began, not in my ears, but vibrating through the very floorboards, through the chair I was trapped in, up into my spine. It was a sound that didn't just vibrate, it rearranged. The hum intensified, a resonant thrum that seemed to unravel the fabric of my surroundings. The room twisted. This wasn't the house anymore. This was my childhood home, but proportions are wrong, distorted and warped. A nightmare reflection of safety twisted into a cage. The doorway, once a simple rectangle, now stretched into a narrow, gaping maw, its edges lined with something that looked like splintered teeth. My breath caught in my throat, a ragged gasp. My own voice. Thin and reedy, foreign, a wave of nausea washed over me, a sickening lurch that made my stomach clench. I tasted ash and something metallic, like old pennies, on my tongue. My muscles spasmed, pulling taut, then relaxing into a horrifying slackness that wasn't my command. No, I croaked, the word a pathetic wheeze. Not me. The entity didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was a suffocating shroud, an invisible weight pressing down, asserting its dominion. It was searching for the last vestiges of Seth, the last spark of individuality, to snuff it out, to absorb it. I felt my memories begin to fray, edges blurring, important faces dissolving into indistinct blurs. My mother's smile, my father's laugh, the warmth of a friend's hand, they were all becoming distant, unreachable. Panic seized me, sharp and absolute. This wasn't just about dying, it was about being erased. About becoming a puppet, a shell. The thought ignited a furious, unexpected spark deep within me. I had lost so much already. My family, my direction, my peace, but I would not lose myself, not like this. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my temples, trying to find an anchor in the swirling chaos. My body convulsed, a violent tremor that shook me to my core. A specific memory. A summer afternoon years ago. I was small, maybe 7 or 8, sitting on the porch swing with my grandmother. The sun was warm on my face, the scent of honeysuckle thick in the air. He was humming a lullaby, her gnarled fingers gently braiding a lock of my hair. Her touch was soft, her presence a quiet, unwavering comfort. He had looked at me then, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and said, "Seth, my brave boy, you have a good heart. Never let anyone take that from you." The words, so simple, so innocent, resonated through the clamor of the entity's assault. My grandmother. Her unwavering love, her strength. It wasn't about grief anymore. It was about the love that had preceded the grief, the enduring connection that had shaped me. It was a memory of being truly seen, truly cherished, truly myself. It was a stubborn warmth, fueled by defiance. I remembered the way her hand had felt, rough but gentle. I remembered the sound of her humming, a melody of peace. The entity recoiled just slightly, a momentary hesitation in its relentless push. It registered the memory, not as despair, but as something else entirely, something it couldn't quite consume. I gritted my teeth, straining against the invisible bonds that held me. My fists clenched, my grip tight. My vision cleared, if only for a second, enough to see the warped doorway of my childhood home, but proportions are wrong, still gaping, still menacing. But now it seemed to waver, its edges less defined. This was my fight. My body, my mind, myself. I felt my grip on reality slipping, the honeysuckle fading, the lullaby growing distant. But I held on. I focused on my grandmother's face, her kind eyes, her unwavering belief in me. Was it enough? Could a single memory, a spark of enduring love, truly stand against such an ancient, ravenous force? The memory of her, so warm, so vital, had been a shield. It had pushed back the insidious cold, the whispers that had tried to coil around my mind. For the first time since I'd stepped into this house, I felt a spark of something other than despair. It was resolve, brittle but growing, like a stubborn weed pushing through cracked pavement. I knew what I had to do. I had to face it, whatever it truly was, and I had to sever the connection. My connection, the house's connection. I walked through the familiar, yet utterly alien hallways of the ancestral home. The air no longer felt heavy with grief, but thick with resistance. Like wading through molasses, the entity was aware. It knew I was no longer a willing meal. Each step I took was a declaration of war. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, not with age, but with a deliberate guttural complaint. Shadows clung to the corners, deeper in gear than ever before, seeming to pulse with a malevolent heartbeat. My goal was not a room, not a specific object, but a feeling, a core, the place where its hold was strongest. I felt it pulling me, or perhaps pushing me, deeper into the house's warped psyche. You don't belong, you are broken, you are alone. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the image of my grandmother's smile burn away the creeping tendrils of doubt. No, I breathed, the word a plume of vapor in the frigid air. I am not alone. When I opened my eyes, the hallway was gone. The walls had stretched, warped. The ceiling soared impassably high, then sagged low enough to brush my hair. I was standing in a space that was unmistakably my childhood home, but its proportions were wrong. The living room, where I'd spent countless hours building forts, was vast and cavernous, the furniture shrunken to dollhouse size. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern I remembered from decades ago, now writhed with indistinct faces, their expressions contorted in silent screams. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just a memory, it was a trap, a manifestation of the entity's power to twist reality, to use my own past against me. It was trying to disorient me, to drown me in a sea of distorted nostalgia. My stomach churned. I gripped my arms, gripped tight, trying to ground myself in the shifting, dreamlike space. The air here smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. Was this the true nature of its feeding ground? I forced myself to move, to navigate the oversized, undersized furniture. The coffee table, usually a shin-level hazard, now reached my chest. Every surface I touched radiated a profound, ancient sorrow. It was trying to overwhelm me with the sheer weight of accumulated grief. This was its currency. This was its power. Then I heard it, a low hum originating from what should have been the kitchen. It vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my chest. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure, a resonance that threatened to crack my teeth. The entity was there. It was waiting. I pushed through the archway, my muscles screaming in protest, as if I was fighting against an invisible current. The kitchen, once bright and welcoming, was now a gaping maw. The sink was a bottomless chasm, the faucet dripping a viscous black liquid that steamed on the floor. The refrigerator stood like a monolithic tombstone, its door slightly ajar, emitting a deep, resonating thrum that pulsed with malevolent energy. This was the heart of it, I knew. This was where the entity had taken root, where it drew its sustenance. It was a nexus of despair, manifesting in the most intimate space of my past. The humming intensified, a physical assault on my eardrums. I could feel my own resolve wavering under the pressure, like a poorly built dam. My vision blurred at the edges. The black liquid on the floor began to ripple, forming indistinct shapes that seemed to reach for my ankles. This wasn't just a psychological trick. It was actively trying to consume me, to pull me into its viscous embrace. I stumbled forward, my breath catching in my throat. I had to get to that refrigerator, to whatever lay beyond its pulsing, humming door. It felt like walking through treacle, each step a monumental effort. My lungs ached. I thought of my grandmother again, her laughter, her strong hands. I thought of the love that had sustained me, the love that had always been there, even through the grief. This entity fed on the absence of love, on its corrosion. I had to show it that love was still here. The humming vibrated through my teeth, rattling my skull. I saw my reflection in the warped metal, gaunt and terrified, but with a flicker of defiance in my eyes. This was it, the reckoning. What would I find when I opened that door? The living room, where I'd spent countless hours building forts from sofa cushions and listening to my mother's gentle humming, now twisted around me like a funhouse mirror. The ceiling pressed down, the plaster cracked in patterns that looked like grasping hands, then it receded so far I couldn't discern its height, only a vast, formless shadow. The walls, once painted a comforting cream, now pulsed with a sickly ochre light, making the familiar furniture seem alien. My small, worn armchair, a relic from my youth, swelled to grotesque proportions, its fabric fraying into what looked like dried sinews. The air, heavy and thick, tasted of dust and something metallic like old blood. I tried to move to take a step, but my legs felt rooted. My body was a lead weight, yet my senses were screaming. The entity was here in this perverse recreation, trying to swallow me whole, to digest my past and make it its own. It wanted me to drown in the nostalgia, to accept this distorted reality as my final resting place. I could feel its tendrils, not physical, but cold whispers sliding through my mind, promising solace, promising an end to the ache. Just let go, Seth, rest here, it's warm, it's safe. But it wasn't safe. It was a lie, a trap woven from my own memories. I clenched my fists, the nails digging into my palms, a sharp, real pain that cut through the illusion's fog. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp. I wouldn't give in, not now, not after everything. This wasn't my childhood home. This was a prison. A small wooden rocking horse, a gift from my father, sat in the corner. It was impossibly large, its painted eyes glowing with an unnerving internal light. I watched it, my stomach clenching. Every detail was a weapon, a hook designed to snag my grief, to pull me deeper into the quicksand of what was and what could have been. A memory surfaced, unbidden, my mother laughing, as she pushed me on that very horse. The memory felt tainted now, a saccharine poison. My resolve hardened. This was not real, she wouldn't want me to give up. I squeezed my eyes shut, blocking out the sight of the monstrous rocking horse, the stretching walls, the impossible ceiling. I focused on the splintered floorboards, the scent of mildew and decaying wood, the sound of the wind whistling through broken panes. Those were real. This was a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, the room was still the childhood home, but proportions were wrong. Yet something had shifted. The ochre light flickered, stuttered. The rocking horse seemed to shrink, though still too large, its glow dimming. "No, stay, you belong here." "No," I rasped, my voice hoarse, raw. It was a single word, but it felt like tearing through thick canvas. "I don't belong here, not anymore." I took a step, then another. My legs still felt heavy, but the illusion's hold was loosening. The floorboards beneath my feet, warped and bending, began to feel solid, though still warped. I walked towards the nearest wall, ignoring the phantom pull, the insidious promises. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pressed my palm against the cool, damp plaster. It felt strangely soft, yielding like old bread. My stomach churned. This was a manifestation of the entity's power, its final, desperate gambit. I pushed. Not physically, but with every ounce of mental strength I possessed. I pushed back against the sorrow, the loneliness, the despair it had fed me for weeks. I rejected the comforting lie. I rejected the notion that this was all there was left for me. I wanted to live. I wanted to be free. The wall rippled under my touch. The sickly light pulsed violently, then began to fade. It felt like my skull was splitting open. I cried out, doubling over, my hands flying to my ears. Though the agony was internal, then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was on my knees, gasping, shaking. My head throbbed. The air was thick with dust and the smell of ozone, like a storm had just passed through a forgotten attic. I looked up. The hallway was back, the ancestral home's hallway, but it was changed. The walls were scorched in places, the wallpaper peeling in blackened strips. Patches of plaster had fallen away, revealing the lath beneath, like exposed bone. The silence was absolute, a profound, deafening quiet that felt both liberating and utterly desolate. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. My body ached as if I'd been beaten. My clothes were damp with sweat, clinging to me. I stumbled forward, my legs still unsteady, through the damaged corridor. The entity was gone, or at least its immediate, overwhelming grasp was. I made my way through the house, each step an effort. The grand staircase, which had often felt like a gaping maw, was now just a staircase, albeit one with several splintered banisters and a thick layer of ash on its steps. When I reached the front door, the heavy oak slab seemed to sag on its hinges. I pushed it open. The late afternoon sun, weak and pale, spilled into the gloom, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stillness. I stepped outside onto the overgrown, crumbling porch. The world outside looked sharper, more vivid. The rustle of dry leaves in the wind, the distant caw of a crow, the feel of the cool air on my face, all of it felt acutely real, painfully present. I looked back at the house, my ancestral home, standing gaunt and skeletal against the gray sky. It was a ruin, a shell, but the malevolence that had choked its every corner, that had tried to consume me, was no longer radiating from its stones. I walked down the few steps, my feet crunching on scattered gravel. I didn't look back again. My mind felt scoured clean, raw. The memories of my mother, my father, my childhood were still there, but they were mine again, untainted by the entity's insidious grip. I kept walking away from the house, towards the winding, overgrown path that led back to the narrow, forgotten road. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon in bruised purples and oranges. I had survived. I had pushed back. But as I walked, leaving the decaying structure behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. And what exactly had it left behind, deep within me, to fester and grow in the long, lonely nights ahead?